In a remote valley surrounded by fog-covered mountains, there was a monastery known as the Refuge of the Wind. It was not a place of great written teachings or strict rules, but a space where silence and nature spoke clearly. There, the monks learned not to fill their minds with knowledge, but to empty them in order to receive the flow of life without resistance. One day, a young man named Daigo arrived at the monastery. He had traveled from a distant city, where he had studied many philosophies and acquired a great deal of knowledge. However, he felt a weight in his heart, an unease that he could not dispel with everything he had learned. He was searching for something more, though he didn't know exactly what. The abbot of the monastery, an elderly man with bright eyes named Master Ryo, welcomed Daigo with a faint smile. Without asking anything, he invited him to walk with him through the monastery's gardens. As they strolled, the master stopped next to a small stream and said, "Look at the water, Daigo. It doesn't cling to any form. It doesn't fight against the stones. It simply flows. It doesn't think about its destination. It just follows its course. The mind of one who wishes to learn must be like the water." Daigo nodded, but countless interpretations of those words appeared in his mind. Determined to demonstrate his understanding, he replied, "Master, I know that water represents adaptability and humility. I have read about its symbolism in many texts." Master Ryo smiled gently and, without saying anything, took a clay cup and began pouring tea from a teapot. The cup soon filled, but the master did not stop. The liquid overflowed and began spilling onto the table. Daigo, surprised, exclaimed, "Master, the cup is full. It cannot receive more." The elderly man nodded and said calmly, "Just like your mind, young Daigo. You arrived here with it so full of concepts and knowledge that there is no space for anything new. If you wish to learn, you must first empty yourself." Daigo fell silent. In that instant, he understood that his search was not about accumulating more information, but about letting go of what he thought he knew. His heart, once restless, began to calm. That same night, Daigo decided to stay at the monastery. Master Ryo assigned him a simple cell, with only a tatami mat and a window overlooking the forest. There were no books or scrolls, only the soft sound of the wind slipping between the trees. The next morning, the master took him to a clearing where the monks meditated in silence. Some were sitting, others simply walking slowly, attentive to each step. Daigo watched with curiosity and asked, "Master, what must I do to attain enlightenment?" Ryo picked up a fallen leaf from the ground and held it in his palm. "Look at this leaf, Daigo. It does not ask where it is going or what it should do. When it is time to fall, it falls. When the wind carries it, it lets itself be carried. It does not resist, it simply is." Daigo frowned, feeling that the answer was too simple. But inside, a part of him began to understand that wisdom was not always found in words, but in the experience of each moment. Over the following days, Daigo tried to empty his mind as Master Ryo had taught him. However, each time he sat to meditate, thoughts and doubts relentlessly assaulted him. His mind filled with questions. Am I progressing? Am I doing this right? How long will it take to understand? One day, while sweeping the paths of the monastery, he approached the master and confessed his frustration. "Master, I try to empty my mind, but the thoughts keep coming. I feel like the more I try, the farther I get from calm." Master Ryo smiled and pointed to a nearby pond. "Look at the water of that pond, Daigo. What do you see?" "I see my reflection, Master. Now, stir the surface with your hand." Daigo obeyed, and his reflection distorted in ripples. The master continued, "If you try to force stillness, you will only cause more agitation. But if you leave the water in peace, it will calm down on its own. The same happens with the mind." Daigo understood that he should not fight against his thoughts or try to stop them. Instead, he must observe them without attachment and allow them to dissipate on their own. That night, when he sat to meditate, for the first time he felt a glimpse of true peace. As the days passed, Daigo began to notice subtle changes in his perception. Before, his mind was occupied with constant analysis, trying to understand everything through words and concepts. Now, he began to experience the world more directly. One day, while walking through the forest near the monastery, he saw an elderly farmer carrying a heavy bundle of firewood. Without thinking, he approached and offered his help. The man smiled and accepted. As they walked together, Daigo felt something new, a genuine connection with the present moment, without the need to rationalize it. When he returned to the monastery, he found Master Ryo waiting for him in the garden. "Today you helped a man without expecting anything in return," said the master. "Yes, master. I didn't think much about it, I just did it," replied Daigo. The elderly man nodded with satisfaction. "That is the principle of a truly open mind, Daigo. You didn't ask yourself if it was the right thing, if it was necessary, or if it would benefit you. You simply acted from the clarity of the moment." Daigo felt a light breeze on his face. For the first time, he understood that true wisdom was not in books or concepts, but in the pure experience of each moment. That night, while observing the moon from the window of his cell, Daigo felt that something within him had changed. It was not a sudden revelation or acquired knowledge, but a lightness, an absence of the burden he had carried for so long. The next morning, while helping the monks with their tasks, Master Ryo approached him and handed him a bowl of rice. "Eat slowly, Daigo," he said with a smile. "Feel the rice in your mouth, the warmth of the bowl in your hands, the aroma rising with the steam. In each bite, there is a teaching if you know how to receive it." Daigo closed his eyes and took a bite. For the first time, instead of thinking about the act of eating, he simply experienced it. There was nothing else in that moment, only the taste, the texture, and the gratitude for the food. And in that moment, he understood something profound. The open and receptive mind does not seek answers. It is simply present to receive them when they come. That afternoon, while sweeping the monastery courtyard, Daigo noticed a small sparrow pecking at the ground in search of crumbs. He watched it silently, amazed by the simplicity with which the bird lived its life. In that instant, a voice behind him interrupted his contemplation. "What have you learned from the sparrow, Daigo?" asked Master Ryo. Daigo smiled and replied, "That it simply is. It does not worry about tomorrow or yesterday. It just seeks its food and sings at dawn." The master nodded, satisfied. "Then today you have learned more than from many books." The next day, Master Ryo took Daigo to the river. There, he asked him to listen attentively. For a while, Daigo only heard the water flowing, the birds singing, and the leaves whispering with the wind. Then he understood the true teaching was always there in the present. After a long time by the river, Master Ryo picked up a smooth stone from the ground and threw it into the water. The stone bounced several times before sinking. Then he took another stone and dropped it without force, sinking immediately. "Do you see the difference, Daigo?" asked the master. Daigo nodded, but he was not sure what it meant. Sometimes the mind jumps from one thought to another, like the first stone. Other times it sinks into a single thought and clings to it, explained Ryo. But the water does not reject any stone. It simply receives them and follows its course. You should treat your thoughts in the same way. Daigo smiled slightly. Each day his mind became a little more like the water. That night, while meditating in the moonlight, Daigo felt the murmur of the river inside him. For the first time, his mind did not try to interpret, analyze, or resist. It simply listened, letting each sound flow without attachment. And in that silence, he understood. The open mind is not one that seeks answers, but one that is willing to receive without expectations. The days passed without haste, and Daigo began to notice that his relationship with the outside world was transforming. The words of the master, though simple, began to take on a deeper meaning every time he encountered someone or something on his path. He no longer felt the need to force the understanding of everything, but instead, he started accepting what came without expecting or resisting. One afternoon, while walking along the path that bordered the monastery, Daigo saw a small flower growing among the rocks. It was silent, not seeking attention, not asking for anything. Its beauty was simple, but perfect, and Daigo crouched down to observe it more closely. In that moment, he felt a deep gratitude for life, for its existence, for its being. A young monk who passed by looked at him and asked curiously, "Daigo, what do you see in that flower?" Daigo looked up at the monk and, for the first time, he didn't feel the need to analyze or give a philosophical response. He simply smiled and said, "The flower is." The monk looked at him confused, and Daigo, recognizing his expression, added, "There is nothing more than that. There is no need to look beyond what is. The flower does not ask why it exists, or if it is beautiful or not. It simply is." The monk remained silent, thinking about Daigo's words, as he continued on his way. That night, Daigo sat by the river, his thoughts still like the water of the pond the master had shown him. As the stars began to shine in the night sky, a question arose in his heart, a question he had not yet asked. What is true enlightenment? He stayed there, without seeking an answer, observing the vastness of the sky and the serenity of the river. The water flowed effortlessly, following its course, not worrying about its destiny. It did not cling to the past or the future. It simply was there, being. In that instant, he understood that enlightenment was not a state that could be attained through effort or knowledge. It was simply a return to the natural state of being, a state that was already present in him, waiting to be discovered. It was not something that could be forced, but something that arose when everything unnecessary was let go. The next day, Master Ryo took Daigo to the monastery garden. There, in the midst of the stone paths, an old rock rested in silence, covered with moss and small flowers. The master looked at it for a moment and then turned to Daigo. "What do you see, Daigo?" Daigo looked at the rock and, for a moment, he felt tempted to give a philosophical answer. However, he remembered the simplicity of the flower and the master's previous teachings. He smiled and said, "I see a rock, master, but not just a rock. I see the time that has passed, the moss growing on it, the flowers that are born and die. I see the stillness and patience of the rock." The master nodded slowly. The rock does not struggle to be anything more than what it is. It does not ask why it is here, nor does it grieve over the passage of time. It simply is. You too are like that rock, Daigo. You do not need to be anything more than what you are. Wisdom is not in seeking, but in being. That night, while meditating under the soft moonlight, Daigo realized that his mind was no longer full of questions or concerns. He had learned to simply be, to allow answers to come without effort, like the water that flows without resistance. In his heart, he no longer sought a future enlightenment or a hidden truth. He knew that everything he needed was in the present moment, in the direct experience of life, just as it is. The peace he had always been seeking had always been there. He had just been too busy to see it. Finally, Daigo understood that the path to truth was not a journey to a distant place, but a return to his own nature. Like the flowing water, the truth was always present, waiting to be recognized. And in that recognition, Daigo experienced true freedom. the freedom to simply be who he was. The search had ended because he had understood that there was nothing to find. All that remained was to be in full harmony with the flow of life.